So, over the last, I don't know, month or so, a couple of things have happened culturally, I guess, that have brought up a lot of memories about Iraq, at least for me and I think for a lot of people. One of them, I went and saw American Sniper, and right around the same time that I was seeing American Sniper, Brian Williams got in trouble for essentially lying about something that had happened to him in Iraq, and that prompted me to write a newspaper column, which also excited a lot of responses. But while I was working on the newspaper column, I found this kind of amazing and disturbing poll that was conducted last year that said that 51% of people, I think it was 51% of people, said that they had opposed the war in Iraq. Not that they opposed it now or that they thought it wasn't a good idea, but at the time they opposed it. And it was something like, 30% or so said that they remembered supporting it. And of course, if you know anything about that time, and the polling at that time, 72% of Americans supported the war in Iraq. So all of this kind of added up in my mind to, A, we don't really know how to talk about Iraq. We don't know how to look at Iraq. We tend to break it off into little tiny pieces because it's so big. The story of our involvement in Iraq is so big, and it stretches out across so many years. We don't know how to talk about it. And not only that, but we don't even know how to remember it. We don't even know how to remember our own attitudes at the time this nation decided, kind of collectively, to go into Iraq. So the other really interesting kind of cultural product recently, in addition to American Sniper. I mean, there have been sort of two things that have got people back in that time, thinking about that time, but maybe in very different ways. The other one is Redeployment, a book by Phil Cly. It's a collection of short stories. Sometimes they seem like Tim O'Brien stories, and sometimes they seem like Graham Greene stories. But what they really are is the product of a really unique writing voice, a voice that stays in your head. If you're dumb enough to read one of these stories before you go to bed, you just dream them all night. So anyway, he's here with us now. In a little while, Frank Rich will join us, somebody who's was one of the early voices trying to talk the United States out of going into Iraq, and somebody who's also really stayed with the story among American stateside journalists. Obviously, there are some wonderful journalists like Dexter Filkins, people like that, who went there. Among stateside journalists, I think Frank Rich has said some really interesting things about this. I wanted us to have a conversation, maybe kind of about how to remember and how to talk about all this. So, Phil Cly, first of all, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
In one of my favorite stories in this book is called, and it's one of the Graham Greene stories. It's called "Money as a Weapon System," and so there's a scene, and we were meeting. First of all, this one takes place later than a lot of the other stories. It takes place, I think, in 2008. We have kind of a civilian who's kind of gone in there as part of a State Department task force, and he's struggling with this really kind of almost comical set of paradoxes going on in the country. But anyway, there's a scene where in the middle of his just confronting all these paradoxes, he happens to be out at this called smoking pit with a military guy, a sergeant. And suddenly Nathan, our young civilian, says, "Can I ask you something? Why are you here risking your life?" He looked at me as though he didn't understand the question. "Why are you?" he said. "I don't know," I said. "That's a shame," he said. He dropped his cigarette, which was only halfway done, and ground it out. Tell me more about that exchange. I think I know what Nathan's thinking about, but I'm wondering what set of thoughts or sensibilities you impute to the staff sergeant at that moment.
Well, I think I'm very glad that you brought up those two polls at the outset, and of course, Nathan. There's another scene in that story where he's talking to an Iraqi, and the Iraqi makes a comment basically about how screwed up Iraq has become as a result of some of the policies that the United States pursued, and he says, "Oh, when this started, I opposed the war," which doesn't mean anything, doesn't let him off the hook in terms of what his responsibilities are. And there's this, that guy's a Foreign Service officer, and he's in this sort of strange place where, he's not a full-throated, hawkish person, but he's trying to go into this country and make things better. He's in a position where he actually has the responsibility to try and do that. And he's dealing with just the kind of insanity and the chaos of the aftermath of a lot of failures, frankly, in the reconstruction effort, and trying to see what he can do. And with that staff sergeant, there's a very particular military ethos. And I think when people talk to me or other vets that I know, there's a kind of assumption that, especially if you join around this time, that means a full-throated endorsement of, every policy of the past decade plus, which is not really true. I have a friend who protested the Iraq War and joined the Army. I joined the Army or I was commissioned in the Marine Corps in 2005, right? So, there'd be debates. When I was going over, I remember people debating, getting in these really passionate arguments with me about whether, or not that we should have gone in, which was an interesting historical question and worth talking about, but not of particular pragmatic interest. And so that staff sergeant, he knows why he's there. And, the reasons that military people come up with are diverse. They're serving their country. They're doing what, their elected leaders ask of them. And they're there to protect their guys and serve with honor and all the other things that are part of the military ethos. And they're not able to control the broad outlines of policy. And so what they can control, there's a kind of pragmatism in the military, which is, I think, very important for enabling them to do their job.
I think your stories bring out how important that pragmatism is because, in fact, so many of your characters are really kind of perched on the brink of going a little bit crazy because of what they're doing or what's happening around them. And so, a frequent refrain in these stories has to do with, I just shot somebody, or maybe I just shot somebody. What does that mean? Did I just kill somebody? And a refrain that goes along with this is kind of, this country is crazy. I don't understand what's happening. And I'm talking more about not so much the Nathan kind of story, but the real sort of combat-oriented stories where these soldiers are really kind of in the moment. And another phrase that comes up a lot, and it comes up in particular in one of the stories where, in fact, a soldier is asking himself those kinds of questions. What comes back to him is, you did your job. And right. I maybe that's the pragmatism you're talking about, that ultimately every day you have to do your job.
Right. It's a professional army. I mean, war is a lot of things, but all of these guys have a job. They have particular missions that they're responsible for, and then and choices that they make within that, choices that they then have to live with. And part of, I think the strangeness of it is, you have an all-volunteer military. You have people who, for the most part, wanted to go over, wanted to do this, and oftentimes were very idealistic. And there are, the ways that they feel about their individual deployment and what they did, and then how they, reconcile that with what's happened more broadly in the war and in terms of, American culture and its relationship to war.
As I'm reading your stories, I'm also thinking, as somebody who was stateside for the entire time, I'll never understand this. This is as close as I've ever felt to understanding it, reading these stories. But for people who didn't experience it, I do think, what it was like to be there, what it was like to experience this is just something we're not going to be able to understand. Is there a particular story within this book that if you had to ask a person who hadn't experienced Iraq to read one story or to understand one tale that you're telling, is there a particular one or maybe even two that you direct them to?
Well, there's not, and that's part of why I wrote the book the way that I did. It's 12 different narrators doing different jobs, and I think it's one important thing is about the Iraq War is, we're talking about over a decade of policy here, and if you went to Iraq, even if you did the same job in Iraq in 2006 in Ramadi, that was nothing like Ramadi in 2008. And I think, there's no one experience. And so, I think that people can understand through, if you meet a veteran and talk to them and have a real engaged conversation, I think there is actually a lot that we can learn from each other as we talk about these experiences. And sometimes an individual might not have a full grasp on what they went through until they talk it out. But I think it takes time, and it's always going to be highly individual, right?
Yes, and that 2006 to 2008 thing is something that surfaces in that same story that I initially referenced. Nathan at one point is talking to a military guy about just how crazy it is and how awful it is and how he just, he doesn't understand how anybody can put up with it. And I can't remember exactly how they get to this point, but the military guy who's kind of kept up this facade with him through their previous interactions in the story, he kind of lets that facade drop, and he said, oh, no, well, 2 years ago you should have seen it. I mean, 2 years ago, it really was madness. Yeah. So that's what you're talking about, right? The spectacle itself, the experience itself, changed radically year to year to year.
Exactly, and it was radically different depending on where you were and what you were doing, right? I mean, there's if there was one narrative or one story that allowed us to wrap the Iraq War up neatly in a bow, I think we'd really like that, but there's not. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to resist the urge to do that, particularly since our involvement with Iraq continues.
In writing these stories, obviously you were where you were. You had the experiences you did in the time period that you did. But these stories, these 12 stories, span other time periods as well. Did you consciously go around gathering stories from soldiers from other time periods? I mean, how did you – because all of these really do have a feeling of immediacy. I feel as the reader as though I really am thrust into a situation that the narrator is experiencing or has experienced. How did you get that?
Well, so, when I was in Iraq, I was a public affairs officer. I ended up spending a lot of time with a lot of different, types of units. And when I came back from Iraq, that's when I started writing the collection. So I'd known a lot of people. And then as I was writing, I was continually reading, towards what I wanted to know. And I was also reaching out to other veterans and getting people's stories and interviewing people. And just trying to develop a thicker knowledge of the subject so that I could explore the issues about the Iraq War that troubled me or confused me or that I thought were worth looking at from different angles. It took about 4.5 years.
Were you surprised when you won the National Book Award? And by asking that question, I'm not calling into question your humility, or but were you?
I was tremendously surprised. I didn't even write a speech until that morning, when it wasn't even until the afternoon because my wife asked me if I'd written a speech, and I said, no, I'm not going to win. And she said, you have to write a speech. And so I did it. I wrote a speech immediately before the ceremony as a kind of just-in-case measure. I was stunned.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm asking not are you surprised because you didn't think you were as good or anything like that as Anthony Doerr or anybody else, but were you surprised because this is a book about Iraq and Afghanistan? It's a book about something that a lot of readers aren't even that comfortable with wrestling with or might kind of identify almost as genre fiction, except that the genre is actually the recent history of the United States. Did you think that might be a strike against it?
I didn't know what the reaction was going to be. I never expected it to have this kind of response. I mean, it's a difficult subject, and I knew that if I was going to write about it, I had to try and be as rigorous and honest in writing about it as possible, which means that there's a lot of sort of hard and unpleasant things in the book that I'm asking the reader to think about and grapple with. So, in that regard, it's been, and also, people tend to like novels more than short story collections. Mm-hmm. But it's been very gratifying having a lot of people reading the book and responding to it.
We're talking to Phil Kly right now. His book is Redeployment, a collection of stories that won the National Book Award. In just a second, we're going to add Frank Rich to this conversation and kind of expand it in a different direction. But before we do that, Phil Kly, one of the themes that does resound through a lot of these stories is how male soldiers define themselves as men, as ways in which sort of the war tests your own ideas about masculinity. And rather than me asking a hyper-focused question about that, maybe you could just react to that a little bit. I mean, what were you trying to get across in some of these stories?
Well, the Marine Corps is a hyper-masculine culture, though of course there are women who serve, and there's one story where there are two Marine veterans, neither of whom have been in combat, and there's a female soldier who was a lioness, so she was attached to an infantry unit and to help search females and manage certain cultural sensitivities, and she's been in combat, and the narrator of that story feels a certain anxiety about the fact that there's war is supposed to be this test of manhood, and she's done it and he hasn't, and I think that notions of masculinity and war are certainly something that have been bound together for a long time, and yet it's a very different culture now within the military and within broader U.S. society, and it's just something that I think has to be talked about if you're going to discuss the military and the Marines' relationships to women, and also some of the kind of toxic masculinity that is certainly present in U.S. society, but sometimes gets amped up on steroids in an all male martial environment, is I don't know, something I think is important to talk about, particularly as the military is going through these changes. Right.
And we do meet some of those men in this book. All right. We're going to take a quick break. Phil Klaya is with us for the whole time. Frank Rich is going to join us here in this next segment. If you want to join us too, our number is 860-275-7266. We're talking about the story of Iraq. Not that that's just one story. All right, we're back. We're talking about Iraq. We've been talking to, and we'll continue talking to, Phil Klaya. His book is Redeployment, the winner of the 2014 National Book Award, and also he's a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, serving 13 months in Iraq. If you haven't read these stories, you have to read these stories. Joining us now also is Frank Rich, a writer-at-large at New York Magazine and the executive producer of Veep, whose fourth season debuts on HBO April 12th. Most pertinently, although he's written a lot of columns, both for the New York Times and for New York Magazine about Iraq, but also, very pertinently, the author of the greatest story ever sold, The Decline and Fall of Truth in Bush's America. So you're both here together. I look forward to having the two of you talk to one another. I'm going to start with a question about sort of history. And Frank, I guess I'll begin with you. I walked out of Clint Eastwood's movie American Sniper, and I had a lot of thoughts about whether or not it really told an Iraq story that I recognized. I thought one of the things that really fascinated me was so much of it took place in Fallujah. And I was kind of waiting for, as the credits rolled up, something saying Fallujah has been held by ISIS for the last year. Of course, that wouldn't make any sense to put it in the credits because this film will be showed for decades to come. But walking out of that movie, I don't know whether you would draw any particular conclusion about Fallujah, but I can't imagine that somebody who didn't read about this regularly would expect to find out that Fallujah right now is held by the people we're the most afraid of and appalled by in all the Middle East. I don't know, maybe you can just sort of comment on how well we've stayed with this story.
Well, I think that, yes, as you said, Colin, the people who follow it and read about it, let alone people who were there, would ask such questions after, American Sniper or any movie that sort of left the Groundhog Day aspect of the story out of it. But I think for a general public that turned on the war, that was not, for the most part, actively engaged in the war because so few Americans had friends and relatives who served, it all sort of blurs together as just kind of a never-ending quagmire that they want to wash their hands of, except, they can look at this particular story and say, well, if they feel this way, he's a hero or he did his duty. At least, America had some boots on the ground that did some good. But to me, a more interesting or a more revealing aspect of the film may be how the Iraqis in general are presented. They're just sort of indistinguishable bad guys, basically. And so it blurs all the history that I'm not sure that Americans ever learned in the first place about Iraq. And, in some ways they're like, the Iraqis are like the Vietnamese and, the Green Beret, the John Wayne movie. They're just sort of extras that are menacing the other and that screwed up America by us trying to help them and getting nothing out of it. I mean, and this is not my view, but I'm just saying that's what I think the way it plays.
Well, yeah, Phil Clay, I want to come back to that in a second, because in some of your stories, the Iraqis are Haji, which is sort of what Charlie was in Vietnam, and they really don't have a lot of identity. In some of your stories, they're really fully blown and finely drawn characters. But just to come back to that original question about historical memory, as you talk to people about Iraq, does the common person's I don't know if the common person exists, but do people's understandings extend all the way to 2015? I mean, it's some way in which their Iraq attention span switches off at a certain point?
Yeah, I think that there are debates that people are more comfortable having. Should we have gone in 2003 is a much easier debate to have than what do we do now, and that's been the case for a while. So yeah, I think that one of the things that whether people are on the left or the right, it's very easy to want to switch the frame of the discussion from something which we have an active part in, which we have a responsibility toward as American citizens, towards a sort of more simplified view of what that war was and how to think about it, and also who to blame for it.
It just one of the characters in the story that we seem to keep talking about here, Money as a Weapon System, or I mean the exact title of it, but there's this guy called the Professor who's a translator, and he's of pretty clearly of Sunni background, and he has formerly been a professor, and he kind of spits these things out at some of the other characters, and he does say at one point, you people have served this country up like a cake for the Iraqis to eat, or something like that.
You've baked Iraq like a cake and given it to Iran to eat,
right?
Which is not my. Is a politician, actually, Iraqi politician said that, and I said I'm going to put that in a story. That character, he's a guy who, when the Americans first came in, he was one of those Iraqis who was very hopeful, right? And, at that point in 2008, he's been working with the Americans for a long time as a translator, and that hope has just kind of curdled in him, and he's sort of at the end of his rope in dealing with the whole, in dealing with the reconstruction effort, and also just sort of seeing the way that his country is going. And so he's willing, because he's kind of fed up, he's willing to tell the narrator of that story things that a lot of other Iraqis wouldn't say directly to an American that they're working with.
Frank, I don't mean to beat to death this whole idea of American ignorance about this question, but, at the beginning, at the outbreak of the war, is either in late 2002 or 2003, it kind of surfaced anecdotally that maybe President Bush didn't understand that there were Sunni and Shia, and what the difference between the two of them are.
Yes, that was actually reported by George Packer in a story in the New York Times magazine at that time.
And that seemed profoundly ignorant, but also, for a president anyway, but also probably pretty typical of Americans at that point. I mean, there wasn't a lot of sophistication about that situation. And I guess I'd wonder if there still is any sophistication about this issue, whether this is sort of something which, as you suggest, because not that many people necessarily know very well, people who served over there, and nobody's, it's just not required reading somehow. I mean, understanding this from beginning to end is not required reading.
Right. Well, I think, first of all, it's more complicated than the also simplistic view of Americans during the Vietnam era of the domino theory was the commies versus America. This is much more complicated, and I would argue that not only do Americans, and I'm not necessarily faulting them, they have other things to do, and the whole way this war has been managed encouraged this, but I suspect most Americans do not know the difference between the Sunni and the Shia. They cannot distinguish between the original Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS. They may not understand the relationship of Iraq to Iran that Phil you just talked about and epitomized in that line about the cake being turned over to Iran. I'm not sure that people really do understand the politics. And I think one reason why American Sniper plays well for those who plays well beyond the emotion and the character and the specific story is it doesn't ask the audience to know any of that. You don't need it to figure out what's going on in that movie, and that's why, to get back to your original question, there's no coda at the end explaining that because frankly, I think if it was there, a lot of people, not maybe people listening to your program and not us, but a lot of people would say, "What? Huh?" I don't think it would really land.
We've got a call from Laura in East Hampton. She's going to bring up something I wanted to bring up anyway, so here we go. Hi, Laura.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
First, I wanted to thank Phil for such an incredible book. I did, as you said, Colin, I read the first story before I went to bed one night, and then I got up the next morning and sat down and read the entire book and didn't get up until I was finished. It was fantastic, so thank you.
Thank you.
My question is regarding, I just read recently, I believe it was in the New York Times, but I might be mistaken.
It was.
It was, okay, thank you. About my inclination has been when I see a serviceman or woman or a police or a fire person as well to say thank you for your service. And having just read recently about that's not necessarily what a returning soldier wants to hear. I guess I would ask Phil, is it? Should I stop saying that? What should we say? I feel like it's rude to not say something, to at least acknowledge that the rest of us have no idea what you've gone through, and here we are living our happy lives while you're over there fighting in conditions I can't even imagine, and how you come home and are expected to live a normal life.
I think that article that article resonated with a lot of people, Laura. Thank you so much for that phone call. And I know that both of our guests want to talk about it. But Phil, why don't you go first? I'm sure you read the same article in which
yes.
A serviceman was basically saying, it's almost like a button people push. That you push the button and the noise comes out and you move on. So talk about that.
I think it's more about the intent behind saying it than necessarily, the individual phrase that's said. Right. A lot of vets talk about this all the time, and in the book there's a character who is talking to a sympathetic civilian, and the guy says, "Well, what should I say?" And he's like, "I reserve the right to be mad at you no matter what you say." I think I've always appreciated it personally, and I know a lot of vets who appreciate it, and I know some vets who are frustrated by it. I think what the worry is our generation, we didn't come back to the sort of reception the Vietnam generation came back to, which is a positive development. But we came back instead to often a lot of indifference. And, we talked earlier about it's a professional military. These are people doing a job. The job matters to them, and they never want to feel like they're being patronized in some way, or that that phrase is all there is. behind the individual citizen's relationship to the wars and what's going on. If you've got a extremely engaged civilian who takes this seriously and says that to a vet, and it's clear that matters to them and that they are engaged, I think most people would appreciate that. But again, it's the sort of the divide that exists currently between the small percentage of people who serve and the civilian population. It's not something that can be papered over with a phrase. So I think it's the intent behind it and also what follows, whether there's a broader conversation about war to be had and about people's experience, or whether it's just something that you say and then feel good about and go on with your day.
Frank Rich, Phil talks about how the Iraq veterans didn't come back to what Vietnam veterans came back to. But it does seem, and it seemed in that article, as though what they came back to is a kind of kabuki that we've learned, that there's some things that you can say almost ritualistically and then move on.
Well, exactly. I think, the word indifference is exactly right. It is, and that is an improvement over active hostility and all the tumult that attended the Vietnam War and the end of it. But I do think you're exact. This indifference, and the people who do use this phrase in not a great way, use it as just sort of a patronizing pat in the head, reflects a problem that's baked into the whole history of the war, which is the American public was told it could be done. The war could be done on the cheap. That it would be done. It would be over, by Christmas. That the results would be unambiguous, and there would be no taxes to have to be paid for it. It would cost nothing in treasure or in blood, and it would be like the Falklands War or something. That's really the impression that was given by the political leadership of America. So it turned out to be wrong. And yet Americans who were not serving really didn't have to make any sacrifice. They never did have to pay taxes. They obviously were never subjected to a draft. For a long time, the fact that the casualties of the fatalities of the war coming back in caskets to America was shrouded in the darkness of night. So there's been a reckoning, at least psychologically, I think, among many Americans that, we did nothing, and these people who served for us often paid an incredibly stiff price as survivors, let alone those who paid the ultimate price. And so there's a kind of, ex post facto bit of guilt, and a good way, I guess, to expiate it is to just say thank you for your service rather than have that longer discussion about the war with the people who served in it, let alone actually do something to ameliorate the lives and welfare of those who served and come back to, as we know, in different or worse health care and everything else. And so I think it's an easy, that's what it's about. I think it's pretty simple.
Phil, you talked earlier on the show about going to war, essentially, in 2005, and things were very different then. I mean, from 2002 to 2003, the run-up, the ramp-up, we talked at the beginning of the show, 72% of the American public supported this effort. The press was very solidly behind it. Democrats in the Senate, people like Chris Dodd and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry and Chuck Schumer all voted for the resolution. But I went back and read a Frank Rich column from 2005 when really a lot of that was already beginning to shred. The war hadn't been over by Christmas. It was going on a lot longer. Right. And there was this kind of almost collective attention fatigue at minimum, if not open hostility towards the war among some of the people who initially supported it. What was that like for you to be? It wasn't like going in 2003, I assume. It was a very different vibe.
It was different. So that's when I was commissioned, and I ended up going to Iraq in 2007. But yeah, that was the period when the American public started to shift. Donald Rumsfeld was still Secretary of Defense, so by that point it was pretty clear that he was very bad at his job. And so, I mean, in a strange way, it sort of clarified my role in this, right? There was a mess, essentially. There was a lot of chaos that we'd unleashed, and ideally, in my mind, the job was, okay, what can we do? The fact that we'd gone in was not something that we could change. So what do we do now? And that goes back to the kind of pragmatism of the military that I talked about before. And that was, I think, something a lot of people felt. And the odd thing about my term of service was I was through the surge. So I was in Anbar province from January 2007 to February 2008. So when I left, I left with a lot of people feeling very good about what we'd done because we'd gone into a extremely violent province. And then the violence level had just been dramatically reduced. And then, of course, all those people have now watched as the situation has unraveled again and had to come to terms with that.
Frank Rich, in your book, you're very tough on the press, justifiably very tough on the press. And, watching what Brian Williams went through over the last month and a half, I found myself thinking, wow, if Brian Williams is the person who's crucified among members of the press because he told this lie. I mean, it was a lie, it was wrong, I'm not excusing it. But when I think of the level of culpability, I mean, there are obviously some people in the press did some great things, and we have mentioned names like George Packer and Dexter Filkins and people who just did incredible reporting about Iraq. But there's some way in which Brian Williams being this kind of sacrificial lamb for the sins of the press that really stretch back to 2002 seems kind of paradoxical.
Colin, I don't buy it. I mean, here's why. I think I've heard this equation a lot, and it's been a recurring theme of Jon Stewart on The Daily Show and others. But here's the problem with it. First of all, Brian Williams, I hate to say it, was part of the press that screwed up originally, and he was an anchor on MSNBC, which had a somewhat different identity than it does now. It wasn't a liberal network; it was more like CNN. He and NBC in general, and all three networks, legitimate networks or legitimate news organizations among the networks, and CNN, none of them questioned the case for war. Unlike the New York Times and the Washington Post, which were also guilty, although not as guilty, there were some reporters in both papers and stories that were buried that did question the rationale for war and the WMD argument. They never went back and looked at what they did. There was huge mea culpa at the Times. A lot of people basically were fired. The whole management structure of the paper changed. Judith Miller wrote some of the most egregious stories, left. That never happened at NBC, and NBC was one of the biggest offenders. It was where people, unlike ABC, where Peter Jennings was skeptical, in NBC people wore flag lapel pins. They were very, very gung-ho about the war, and no one questioned anything. And so maybe Brian Williams' inflation of it wasn't just his war experience, as we know now, his other stories too. Maybe that's bearing some of the burden, but that doesn't clear him because he was part of the problem to begin with. And I think that James Fallows of The Atlantic wrote an excellent blog post, I guess it was, about another aspect of the Brian Williams thing, what it's carrying the burden of. And you see this a little bit perhaps with this Bill O'Reilly nonsense too, a kind of, as he put it, a chicken hawk situation where a lot of people who haven't served in the armed forces and who cheerled this war feel guilty, and that drives them to, in an extreme case like Brian Williams, stealing valor, taking some heroic credit for daring do in the war. That to me is a much more interesting interpretation of what's going on with Williams and this story, more than, and I think that people do know that. I wish people did remember more, and this was of course the subject of my book, just how badly news organizations, not all of them, but most of them, behaved in that crucial early period.
Phil Cly, given how bad Americans, I think, are at absorbing this story, and particularly this story as it stretches from the earliest stirrings in 2002 or earlier to the present, you kind of want, I could drag out the Santayana quote about those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it, but you kind of want any nation, any society, maybe any world to learn from what happens. And I'm wondering whether you think that we're capable of learning anything from Iraq if, in fact, maybe we don't even understand, as a country, don't even really understand very well what happened from year to year.
I hope so. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, and one of the reasons I'm very pleased about the continuing outpouring of books about Iraq. I think it would be a bit much to expect every year, your average American to have a complex and nuanced understanding of the various ethnic and religious rivalries and complications in Iraq and how those relate to our policy over the past, decade plus. It's a complicated and hard subject. I do think that we need to be I think we need to have a more nuanced understanding of it. I think we need to accept the fact that we have a responsibility towards what happened. I think we need to be more critical of the stories about war, and I think we need to hold people accountable. The things that Brian Williams said about where he was and what he did, those are not it's not on my top 10 list of things that frustrate me most about the Iraq War. There's I think what Frank Rich was mentioning, this serves as a place where we can clearly point to somebody, and in a certain way it's a much easier conversation to have than I think some of the ones that we need to be having.
Frank, Rich, we're about to wrap up this segment, and I know you're going to go, and Phil and I are going to come back for a final segment. But, sure. Going during the run-up, and particularly before Colin Powell kind of got sidetracked into that UN speech, he articulated this thing called the Pottery Barn Principle, which is not, I don't know, his idea, but it's you break it, you bought it. You break it, you own it. And I think that's it's a relatively easy thing to understand. And I was wondering, just to follow up on my question to Phil, whether there's some version of that now, maybe not that principle, but you in one of your New York Magazine pieces quoted Mark Danner. I think he was maybe reviewing the Rumsfeld movie. This feels like Russian dolls nesting towards each other, but
right.
But he said something to the effect that this one of the things that happened was that this somewhat fragile and pretty violent balance between Sunni and Shia. It wasn't really in balance, but it was disrupted enough so that what's happened has kind of spilled all over the Arabian Peninsula and into the subcontinent. That I wonder if there's a lesson that we can learn, that something like, just because you see an ugly situation like Saddam Hussein, that doesn't mean you can replace it with a vastly better situation.
Well, yeah, I would hope that would be a lesson learned, and certainly that's something that, to some extent, I think President Obama has been trying to articulate as a lesson learned from the failure of, I guess, what is known as the Bush Doctrine. That we could just sort of go in there and, from the green zone, erect a democracy and override, centuries of history. But I don't. Again, I don't say this to criticize the American public. I'm not sure we're there yet. I'm not. Maybe we are. I think it's a little more generalized than that. I think it's more. We don't want to be involved in anything unless we see Americans being beheaded, and then we want to take those people out. Somehow pinpoint them, take them out, ideally, from the air or with drones, better still, and have a surgical procedure where we stop, the bad guys. So in some ways, people still sort of believe in what George Bush promised would happen. We'd get the bad guys out dead or alive, and then everything else would be fine. So I don't know if people I don't know if people are thinking in that way about the history of the region and about how America really can't change that, no matter what our goodwill or what the hell we do. I just don't know. I don't know if people are thinking that far. Do you think they are?
No, I think. I think pretty much. I think you've articulated it pretty well. Is that I mean the rationale in 2002 to 2003 for going in was there was an imminent threat towards us, and now that people don't perceive an imminent threat, I think they've in large part kind of stopped thinking about this. Frank Rich, thanks so much for joining us.
Great talking to you both as always.
We want to talk more to Phil Kleier. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back. We won't have much time, but I have at least one more question that I want to ask him.
Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me, Kyone Wolf. Our intern is Sydney Lauro. Greg Hill tweets for us at WNPR Colin, and Katie Tolarski is our executive producer. The part of Bill Curry was played by Valerie Plame. For show pages, articles, and PDFs of the Faith Middleton Show staff's yellow cake uranium recipes, visit our website, WNPR.org. On tomorrow's show, our salute to skin microbes. Now, back to Colin.
I love that there was just a promo for Lysistrata, which is, of course, one of the first anti-war plays and very much about masculinity in some of the ways that Phil was talking about. Phil Kleier is with us. We really only have time, last, for one more question. The book, by the way, is Redeployment. It won the National Book Award. You don't need me to tell you it is an incredible critical success and just a great read, too, these 12 stories. This may have already happened, Phil, but if it hasn't, I bet you it will someday. You'll be in some Midwestern city doing a reading and signing, and some young guy will come up to you and say, I just graduated from high school, and I read your book, and I was thinking about enlisting, and I can't really tell, reading Redeployment, whether Phil Kleier would want me to enlist or not. What would you say to that guy?
I wouldn't tell him no. Mm-hmm. I am glad that I served in the military. And I think most veterans, feel that way when they do polls of veterans. They, a lot of veterans are skeptical or angry about some of the policies of the past, 10 years or so. But overwhelmingly they say that they would do it again. So I think that there's a lot that you can get out of the military. I think that I got a lot out of it, but it's a serious decision, and I think the thing to consider is, there are the obvious risks that are a part of it, but also thinking about the fact that if you sign the military, you're signing up, for at least 4 years, giving your life to your country to do whatever they would have you do, and you don't actually control that, right? Mm-hmm. There's one unit recently where they were deciding between two deployments. They were either going to go to Africa to help out with Ebola, or they're going to go to Guantanamo Bay. Could have been either one. But when those guys get back, they'll get very different receptions based on what type of service, right? And so just think very seriously about whether you're willing to make that decision for your country, and then be willing to accept the fact that you can't control it, and that historically America has not always used its soldiers' lives as wisely as it could have.
That's a great answer. We're going to have to stop there. I dare not ask you another question. But Phil Kleier, so great to talk to you, a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, serving 13 months in Iraq, the author of Redeployment, the 2014 National Book Award winner. Thanks also to Frank Rich, writer-at-large for New York Magazine. Thanks also to Betsy Kaplan, who pulled this show together. We'll be back tomorrow with the story of the microbe. It's all the microbes in your body, but especially the ones that live on your skin. They have stories to tell, and they may have other things to contribute to us if we use the science around them wisely. So join us for that. Thanks for listening today. We'll be back tomorrow.